Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm really happy to be here with everybody. This is Caribbean Studies Assessing the Current Research Landscape, and we gave everybody just a minute to enter into the room and get settled in. So we'll get started now, and I'll just very briefly let everybody know the way that we are planning on doing the session. So our panelists, Stephanie Chansey, Katie Coldiron, and Margot Grunewald are going to be our panelists. We will go in alphabetical order, and we should have about half an hour at the end of the session for Q&A. I will be monitoring, and if you want to put questions in the chat as we go along, I'm happy to keep a note of those. And then, of course, we should have some time at the end as well for you to ask your questions. And so I would like to begin by, first of all, thanking everybody for being here and thanking DLOC for this panel. I'm actually very excited to hear all of our panelists, and I'm glad that we're doing this to keep at least my brain in the research during the long and warm summer months. Our panelist, Stephanie Chansey. Stephanie is the Caribbean Partnership Librarian and Director of Operations for the Digital Library of the Caribbean, DLOC, at the University of Florida's George A. Smathers Library. She received her PhD in History from Florida International University and her Master of Arts in Liberal Studies and Bachelor of Science in Communications from the University of Miami. Stephanie's research focuses on Atlantic material cultures, especially in the cultural and artistic exchanges between the Caribbean, Europe, and the United States. Stephanie taught U.S. history and art history at the undergraduate level for over a decade, and prior to her academic career, she worked in nonprofit arts administration. Katie Coldiron is a Latin American and Caribbean Studies librarian and a doctoral candidate in history at Florida International University in Miami, Florida, and I am a very big fan of her work. Her research interests include 20th century Latin American Caribbean history, intellectual and cultural history, and Cold War history. Her professional interests include post-custodial digitization and aiding research on Latin America and the Caribbean via library and archival materials. And then, of course, last but not least, Margot Grunewald, located in Curaçao, Dutch Caribbean, is an independent scholar working with academic partners in the Caribbean, the US, and the Netherlands. She is a cultural and social historian interested in new narratives about Caribbean transnationality, mobility, modernity, and radicalism. In the field of digital humanities, Grunewald is a guest editor for Archipelago's Journal 2025 and collections consultant for the Digital Library of the Caribbean, DLOC. And of course, DLOC is one of the reasons we are gathered here today. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to our panelists. And like I said, happy to monitor the chat, and we'll have Q&A at the end. So we will start with Stephanie.
It's only been 6 years and I almost forgot to unmute myself. Thank you everyone for being here. It warms the heart to see that we have such a very nice showing for our panel presentation today. I am going to share my screen. And are you seeing? Participants can now see my screen. Perfect. Yes, the technology gods are on my side today. So there are myriad Caribbean stories that are waiting to be told. Tales of daring and resistance, of loss and victory, of big and small acts, and of the everyday and the common. The historical actors who created this complex and rich history performed actions that were both mundane and extraordinary. Using the Caribbean nation of Haiti as an example, we see that the dominant narrative is that of great men, Toussaint Louverture, Henri Christophe, and of epic actions, the only successful uprising of enslaved people. Men such as Haiti's founding fathers were indeed illustrious, and the establishment of the first free Black republic in the Western Hemisphere by formerly enslaved individuals was undeniably a remarkable feat. History, however, is not just comprised of the outstanding, but also of the modest, the routine, and the day-to-day lives of regular people. Why then do we not see more stories of the typical? Are we destined only to convey the tales of great men and epic actions? Where are the women and the non-famous? In his seminal book, Silencing the Past, Michel-Rolph Trouillot indicated that historical narratives are often the result of, quote, uneven contributions and unequal access, end quote. Trouillot's point is particularly evident in the context of Caribbean studies. But what did Trouillot mean? In my paper, I propose an explanation and offer possible ways of evening, and if it's not a word, it should be, contributions and equalizing access. As those of us here know and understand, scholars who are weaving the tales of Caribbean actors often rely on fragmentary documentation and sparse information. Sources are frequently spread among many archives and libraries far from the Caribbean. Illustrating this point are two recent works on Haitian history. Julia Gaffield's I Have Avenged America, Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Haiti's Fight for Freedom, and Marlena Doubt's The First and Last King of Haiti, The Rise and Fall of Henri Christophe, both published in 2025. The points on the map show the locations of the different archives, libraries, and collections that each visited to accomplish their research. In her list of archive abbreviations, Gaffield names 17. Only one is a library in Haiti. For her part, Doubt lists 10. None are in Haiti. Most of these collections are in Europe and the US. The most unexpected, Copenhagen in Denmark. Slightly less surprising, Bergamo in Italy on Doubt's list. Is it any wonder that it takes years to produce a history monograph? The dispersal of Caribbean primary documents across the globe is testimony to the region's one-time status as a colonized zone. It is also illustrative of Trouillot's point about uneven access. How many of us can spend a month, a year, or more traveling to different archives on what frequently results in finding few to no documents that are pertinent to our projects? Access is further hindered within the Caribbean because of unrest, political maneuvering, and climatological impact. These mean that archives are not always accessible. More significantly, irreplaceable collections are imperiled and under threat of being lost. This removes everyone's access. The confluence of financial and time limitations, along with the other factors cited, mean that only certain scholars get to use primary resources. Thus, historical narratives are set by just a few. Are we then destined to know Toussaint Louverture's story and not Louise Louverture's story? You know, of course, that my answer is no. My early and continuing research on Louise Louverture is not only an example of uneven contributions and unequal access, it illustrates how one can bring to light the story of a 19th century woman of color who has been overshadowed by her more famous male relative. So who was she? Louise Chancy Louverture was born in 1782 in the southern province of Saint-Domingue, near Les Cayes in the town of Torbec. She was the daughter of a formerly enslaved African woman and a white colonial planter who died mere months before her birth. Her given name, Louise Chancy. Her mother, Geneviève Afiba, was Toussaint Louverture's half-sister. The two shared a father. The half-siblings reunited in 1800, and on his return home, Toussaint Louverture took her three youngest children with him, Louise Chancy among them. Thus, in 1802, When her uncle and his family were arrested and deported to France on Napoleon's orders, Louise Chassis was with them. She arrived in France in 1802 at about almost 20. In 1803, 1804, she married Isaac Louverture, Toussaint Louverture's son and her companion in exile. She died in Bordeaux in 1871 at almost 90, after having spent nearly 70 years in France. I chose to write about Chassis Louverture after stumbling across her portrait in an art book. In my project proposal, I stated that given her prominence as demonstrated by the portrait, I was sure to find evidence of her life in US and European archives. I was not entirely incorrect in that assertion, but I was naive in the belief that she would be easy to find. Along with the portrait, I also had extensive passages in a secondary source, Sally McKee's The Exile's Song, about another African-descended exile in France. McKee quoted the announcement of Madame Louverture's passing. It was found in the Bordeaux newspaper, La Guyenne. The newspaper was digitized in just the last 2 or 3 years, and that is what finally allowed me to see the announcement for myself. You'll note the announcement refers to her as Madame Veuve Louverture, the widow Louverture, not as Louise Louverture. With this concrete information in hand, surely there was more evidence for me to examine. And indeed, I found that the archives in Bordeaux hold some of her papers. Their website, however, indicates the file is incomplete. I'm gonna pause here for a minute and let you all know, I had no plan B for replacing Louise in the dissertation that I was writing. So it was like, you got to do something. As I continued to read the primary and secondary documents, she continued to be mentioned, again, often not by her given name. Moreover, those same sources indicated the existence of papers belonging to the exiled Louverture family somewhere. Most scholars believed they were lost. There was a brief statement by the Haitian historian Alain Tournier in one of his books that indicated that these lost papers were in fact in Haiti at the Musée du Panthéon National Haïtien, MUPANA, where he examined them. However, since 2019, most of the world's nations have placed advisories warning against travel to Haiti, so flying to Haiti was not a possibility. On the chance that MUPANA had digitized the papers and made them available online, I Googled, which is how I learned that MUPANA is part of the Archives Nationales d'Haïti, one of the Digital Library of the Caribbean's founding partners. A browse of their collection turned up a somewhat innocuous lettre de visite written by Louise Louverture in 1803. This digitized primary document helped me make and support an important argument about Madame Louverture's life in France. Digitizing documents like Chassis Louverture's lettre de visite is one way of evening access. Digital archives such as DLOC, Gallica, and others bring documents that live far from us closer to us. When the sites are free and open, as DLOC and Gallica and others are, it makes access more equitable. And thus, different people get to write the stories, resulting in different stories. Of course, I needed more than one primary document, so I turned to the portrait. And I used that as one of my primary documents. This was commissioned by Madame Louverture during her 3 to 5 year period that she spent in Haiti reclaiming family land. And it reveals quite a bit about her. For one thing, it illustrates how she wanted to be remembered. It exemplifies her dignity and control. These were characteristics prized and cultivated by women of her period. Her clothing and accessories underscore the latter. For example, the lace not only softens the severe dress, it stresses her femininity and delicacy. The lace details also place her in the upper echelon of bourgeois society. Since its introduction in the 16th century, lace was seen as a sign of luxury indicative of the wearer's social status. Despite these touches of luxury, her clothing is modest, which further highlights her conformity to the feminine ideals of the time. A woman's modesty in that period was prized. Her hair, covered by the lace day cap, is plainly styled, and this too is a sign of her modesty and in keeping with the move away from the more complicated hairstyles and headdresses that were in style prior to the French Revolution. Now, the portrait has a muted background. She is there, she's sitting at a prayer desk, and she's holding a rosary in one hand. And we can assume that the book placed in front of her is a prayer book or a Bible. And these all are taken together to signal her piety. This was another prize, another trait that was prized in women in this era. Now, there are letters written by her husband that survive. Some are in fragments and others in their entirety. At the University of Florida, where I am based, there are 2 which he wrote and a third written to him. Now, here you see the information that is in our finding aid. If you were based in New York, France, Curacao, based on what you see here, and your subject was Louise Louverture, would you travel to Gainesville to come and look at these 3 letters? I will hazard a guess and say probably not. There is really no indication that these letters would be pertinent to your subject. The reality is, however, all 3 letters are relevant. In the first, dated 1823, Isaac Louverture, writing to an unknown woman about a financial obligation, mentions ma femme 3 times, my wife, but he does not say her name. The December 1825 letter from a Haitian official directed to Isaac Louverture refers to votre épouse, your wife, and it indicates how pleased he and his family were to receive Louise Louverture during her time in Haiti. The third, dated February 10, 1824, Isaac Louverture actually sent to his wife while she was in Haiti. The letter addresses her as ma chère amie, my dear friend. Again, no name. The back, however, directs it to Madame Louverture, née Chancy. Louise Louverture, unnamed, is all over these letters. The latter gives us evidence of Trouillot's uneven contributions. Here we have a historical actor whose activities are veiled in the archive. The anecdote, however, is illustrative of what the French historian Arlette Farge asserts in her book, The Allure of the Archives. Women are, quote, astonishingly present in the archive, though they appear in glimpses that reveal their lives and that they engaged in the social and political life of their time. Those engagements and contributions are, however, unevenly recorded. As I started, there are myriad Caribbean stories waiting to be told, but to tell many of them, the scholar needs to be creative and use sources that may not necessarily be traditional, such as a portrait. As collections are increasingly digitized and made openly available online, access to primary resources increases. How those sources are described and cataloged, however, can continue to cloak the contributions of certain historical actors. The 3 letters that I mentioned illustrate that it is perhaps a good thing, that it is a good thing that to an extent historians are thwarted detectives, because our projects are largely investigations that require creativity, patience, and lots of luck. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. And I think I actually, for the first time ever, came in under time.
Thank you, Stephanie. And we will pass it on to Katie Coldiron.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It's really nice to see so many familiar faces. And also thank you to Lupe, Stephanie, and Margot for agreeing to do this. So without further ado, I will go ahead and share my screen. All right, can everybody see my slides?
Yes, we see presenter view, however.
Better?
Better.
Okay. All right. So the title of this presentation today is Writing the History of Revolutionary Cuba from Abroad. And I'll start with the preface that this kind of comes from the two hats I wear, which is researcher doing a PhD in history and also a librarian who's helping people find what they need for research on Latin American and Caribbean topics. But by virtue of where I am based, I get a lot of folks who want to do Cuba projects, including post-59 Cuba. So that's where I'm coming from today. So in 1962, Carmelo Mesa Lago, a young lawyer from Cuba, arrived at the University of Miami to form part of the Cuban Economic Research Project, a research initiative carried out by exiled Cuban intellectuals that sought to write an economic history of the island nation. Apart from being a lawyer, Mesa Lago was also a budding political economist, having taught public policy classes at 2 universities in Havana, as well as helping to found Cuba's first bank for Social Security in 1959. Like many other Cubans, however, he became disillusioned with the rapidly changing political situation in his home country and left for Spain in 1961. A call from his sister rerouted him away from taking a job as a Spanish teacher in Oklahoma and towards another opportunity to work on questions of Cuban political economy. Like other Cuban exiles, Mesa Lago would be unable to return to his home country until the late 1970s, and thus relied on published resources from Cuba to be able to conduct his research, most notably the statistics coming out of Cuba. He's an economist. 64 years later, and now retired, he's in his 90s, Mesa Lago, despite being continuously limited in the ability to travel to the island, has become known as the father of Cuban studies. Fast forward to the year 2026, and traveling to Cuba, well, I'll go back for now. Fast forward to the year 2026, and traveling to Cuba for research by both Cubans and non-Cubans once again seems to be in the realm of the impossible. For one, a deepening humanitarian crisis has left much of the island in prolonged blackouts, and a potential invasion from the United States is a looming threat. Furthermore, there are the difficulties surrounding research in Cuba that predate the current crisis, specifically the historic unavailability of archives from much of the post-1959 period, travel restrictions emanating from both the U.S. and Cuban governments, the physical deterioration of archives and other library resources in an unforgiving climate, and the obvious political contours of doing research within an authoritarian state. However, one might also argue that at the current moment, doing research on Cuba is an imperative, as the island nation sits on the precipice of change, the nature of which we still do not know. Therefore, I will focus this presentation on doing historical research on Cuba with a focus on the post-1959 period, while not being able to travel there. Basically, yes, this presentation is geared towards what you can do while not being able to travel to Cuba, utilizing my own experiences as both graduate student and librarian, as well as examples from research projects currently in development. So, historical research on post-1959 Cuba began in earnest only after the new millennium, following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent political and economic crises in Cuba known as the Special Period in Times of Peace. Leading the way among US-based historians was Lillian Guerra, a mentor of mine and based at the University of Florida, who had previously conducted archival research on the island for the pre-59 period, specifically the Cuban Republic, in her own dissertation research during the 1990s. Increasingly skeptical of the claim that research on post-59 Cuba was impossible, she began scouring both well-known and obscure press resources, as well as the collections of journalist Andrew St. George and activist David Stone at Yale University, where she was based at that time. The result of these efforts was her 2012 monograph, Visions of Power in Cuba, Revolution, Redemption, and Resistance, 1959 to 1972, the winner of the Bryce Wood Book Award from the Latin American Studies Association in 2014. And I always tell people if you read one book on the Cuban Revolution, it should be that one. Following Guerra are multiple historians seeking to understand what has been called the revolution from within, focused on wide-ranging topics ranging from dance to debates surrounding historical memory, with notable names including Michael Bustamante, Michelle Chase, Jennifer Lamb. I have her co-edited volume with Michael here. Elizabeth Schwall, whose book I did not grab well, and then Devin Spence Benson. Additionally, a large body of work has also emerged that looks at Cuba through a transnational lens, employed by historians like Karen Dubinsky, Renata Keller, and Tayshaun Latner. The works of all these authors have made ample use not only of Cuban state press, but also archives sourced outside of the island. With the dawn of the digital age, some Cuban press and other resources have made it into digital library collections across institutions. For example, the Digital Library of the Caribbean, DLOC, features large and comprehensive collections of multiple Cuban newspapers and periodicals, such as the magazine Bohemia, which existed before '59, but then after '59, it's expropriated and it's a publication of the state, and Noticias de Hoy, the latter the newspaper of the former Partido Socialista Popular, the predecessor of the modern-day Cuban Communist Party. Many of the numbers of these publications appearing on DLOC are the direct result of the project Celebrating Cuba, a project coordinated by the University of Florida George A. Smathers Libraries during the Obama-era diplomatic opening to Cuba. The UF Libraries also led, and I have this picture here, led an effort to make available the catalog records of the Biblioteca Nacional de Cuba José Martí on OCLC WorldCat, thus making a substantial portion of a catalog that was previously only available in physical format accessible to the world. And that is a card from my own research at the National Library 2 years ago. Before they let me look at archives, they let me look at the catalog. So I'm grateful for it, honestly, because a lot of what I did is I would take pictures of these cards and then find the publications outside of Cuba, because the thing you're going to be able to find most of the time outside of Cuba is the press. Now, for the more obscure press, it's a little more difficult, but in the case of this resource, this URSS magazine, it actually is not coming out of Moscow, as it indicates there. Rather, this was a Spanish language publication supported by the Soviet Union that was actually produced in Mexico. So, kind of exciting transnational collections there. Additionally, the University of California, Los Angeles Library has become a leader in post-custodial digitization within international partners, which has extended to Cuba. Through a partnership with the Cuban Instituto de Historia, UCLA was able to digitize resources spanning both the pre- and post-1959 periods. Beyond university and research libraries, companies like Eastview and Brill have engaged in digitization efforts on the island, with a notable high-use collection being Brill's Cuban Culture and Cultural Relations 1959 On, which is a digital archive of documents digitized at Havana's Casa de las Americas. So my current dissertation research focuses on the history of Cuban studies as a field in the United States. Well, I was able to travel to Cuba in July 2024 for archival research. It's the last time I was there. Most primary sources I use have been sourced outside the island in both digital and physical formats. One of the most important collections for this work has been the records of the Ford Foundation, available at the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York. Beginning in the 1960s, the Ford Foundation was an early funder for Latin American and other area studies fields, and for a time was the primary funder of research initiatives related to Cuba being carried out in the United States. Within grant files available on microfilm, many of which that are hundreds of pages long, I have been able to understand not only the Ford Foundation point of view, but also those of grantees themselves via correspondence, periodic grant reporting, and other materials deemed relevant to a particular project. While not fitting neatly into either the revolution from within or transnational Cuba paradigms, I have found myself also striving to understand how Cubans on the island, especially government authorities, viewed research and proposals for projects emanating from the United States. With a few documents from Cuba in hand, I have also had luck via the second-hand accounts of conversations with Cuban government figures available in collections within the United States. A notable example of this is from the Instituto de Estudios Cubanos records available at the University of Miami Cuban Heritage Collection, my vecinos across town. The Instituto de Estudios Cubanos was a predominantly Cuban exile and Cuban American organization that, while not based at a university, is still largely considered an academic organization due to the overwhelming presence of academics within the organization and its leadership. Many IEC members were able to take advantage of the opening from the Cuban government to Cuban exiles for visits in the late 1970s, with the IEC later hosting meetings with their Cuba-based counterparts on the island. To that end, I have found numerous reports and correspondence recounting these trips to the island and conversations with those Cubans based there. Of course, I am not the only history graduate student currently engaged in dissertation research on post-59 Cuba. For example, at the University of Florida, Lisa Krause, a good friend, is writing a dissertation on Cuba-East German relations. And while she did do research in Cuba, she does also rely heavily on the Stasi Records Archive located in Berlin, which houses documentation from the East German Ministry of State Security. And you'll see the picture there on the right. That is Erich Honecker and Fidel. And I have periodically been sending Lisa as I kind of browse through Bohemia on DLock. I'll find articles and spreads of like, East German, Cuba solidarity, the visits of Honecker to Cuba, all that fun stuff. There's also Elio Alves de Souza, who is another history graduate student at the University of Florida, who is writing a dissertation on political and economic reforms in Cuba from the 1970s to the 90s, a project which has led him to do research at institutions like the Hoover Institution Library and Archives at Stanford, like myself, and also the University of Miami Cuban Heritage Collection. At the University of Texas at Austin, Chastity Brown, who is here, thank you, Chastity, for being here, a doctoral student in the Department of Art History, has written a dissertation on the series of exhibitions by Afro-Cuban artists known as queloides, meaning a type of scar, which challenged the historic silencing on the part of the Cuban state of issues related to race and highlighted the continued existence of anti-Black racism in Cuba post-59. And you'll see there that photo. So queloides happened for the first time, this exhibit, in 97 and 99 in Havana. It was not widely publicized at all because it was still, this is the 90s. This is still like, immediate post-Soviet period, discussions on race, like the famous Fidel claim in 61 that racism was over in Cuba. And obviously that wasn't the case. And then the inequities of the 90s really highlighted that. And that photo is from the great Rene Peña, photographer based in Cuba. And so basically this promotional image was from a recreation of queloides in 2010 at the University of Pittsburgh. And Alejandro de la Fuente, the historian now at Harvard, really led that effort. Indeed, and aided by the digital age, the works of artists affiliated with queloides have transcended to the island to enter the international art space, with some pieces available via the Cuban Art Database as well as physically in galleries like Cernuda Arte in Miami. As Brown has mentioned to me as well, she has relied on exhibition catalogs and other cultural publications for her work, and she has conducted research here in Miami at Cuban Heritage Collection in Spain as well as Cuba. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that this presentation is in no way an endorsement for not doing research in Cuba if you can. On the contrary, my research and other professional experiences in Cuba have shaped my life in numerous ways, and I consider the resources I was able to source in Cuban archives in 2024 for my dissertation research to be equally important to those I found on the outside. Additionally, beyond the experiences of archives, there is much to be said about being in a place for an extended period, which provides one with a level of understanding that they would not be able to achieve elsewhere. Rather, I view this topic through the lens of both historian and librarian working in Miami, with his aspirations to research certain topics while at the same time being cognizant of where things are located and the limitations that certain topics do bring. Furthermore, being based in Miami, I find myself serving many researchers who are Cuban exiles or Cuban Americans, who, for a variety of reasons, often find themselves unable to travel or return to the island. Rather than tell these researchers to not study their own nation, I consider it necessary to point them in directions that can also serve their respective topics. Indeed, as events continue to unfold in Cuba, travel for the time being seems off limits not only for the Cuban diaspora, but for anyone seeking to understand a fascinating, complex history that, while inherently global, is nonetheless rooted in the Latin American and Caribbean story. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And we will pass it along to Margot now.
Thank you. And I repeat everything that's been said already about how happy I am to be here and to have the chance to share something with you. Now, I need to find my presentation. Here it is, and share it with you. And then use this presentation mode. So is this okay? I think you see a black screen still.
We
No,
see
we see your
presentation.
slides.
We can see it.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Yes, well, the thing that I want to share with you is not sort of the usual presentation. I'm not sharing my historical research this time, but I want to involve you in a conversation. And this is a conversation I've been having with a lot of people in the Dutch Caribbean for some time now, and for which I did do some research, not so much historical research, but just looking for other areas that had, gone through the same challenges. And so this really is a conversation about North-South academic inequalities and epistemic justices relative to non-sovereign territories. And knowing that the Dutch Caribbean is not, it's not very familiar for many people, even within the Caribbean. I just want to start with the image of the Dutch Caribbean, and then I'll take you along with the specific situation relative to research, the things that already came up with Stephanie and Katie about the difficulties, the challenges in doing research, but then move to more of the infrastructure and the facilitation of research. But to start with, who are we? I'm based in Curacao. We are, as Dutch Caribbean, 6 islands. Curacao was always the not only the biggest of the 6, but also where the government was based. And as this picture by Ocalia perfectly showed, being Dutch sort of was very very much centralized in the self-image, and this has been internalized as well as externalized. So knowing that this is our image, I should start off this presentation with saying we're not an anomaly and we're not that Dutch. We're much more than just that. Non-sovereignty, is that a problem or a fact? We're one of, so many non-sovereign territories in the Dutch Caribbean, and that was a very deliberate choice made already in the 1930s. The first thoughts were sort of shaped and shared about non-sovereignty as an end result. And still, historians and scholars have problematized that, such as in this publication. It's very hidden, but still, it's very important to see how the relationships are viewed. Here in this publication by 2 Dutch and a French scholar, they are considered remnants of former colonial empires that are still non-sovereign. And I think most of you in this room will be familiar with the work of Yarimar Bonilla, and I apologize for my Spanish pronunciation, who published several articles showing that it's not just an oddity or a in-between status, but something that is, part of our reality. And also, and that's, I think, an important element, it's not just something to be, fixed. So what I want to share with you today is something about epistemic justice that has surfaced in the Dutch Caribbean, especially more recently through this publication on slavery and the Dutch state, which was commissioned by the Dutch government, in which it was concluded that numerous mechanisms within the academic business of the Dutch Caribbean have led to inaccessibility and even exclusion of people and perspectives. So this was a conclusion not about a historic situation, but something actual that needs to be acted upon. But just as a side note, there was a follow-up knowledge agenda shaped and published after this publication. And this is all very recent. This is from 23, 24. And the knowledge agenda does not continue. It isn't even mentioned, this, I think, very important conclusion in this knowledge agenda. And there's a lot behind that. So I just want to break down exclusion of people and perspectives. What does, what's the situation here? Of course, in general, when we talk in perspective in research, it is about representation and about inclusion. It is, when it comes to projects, research projects, something you hear a lot on the islands. It cannot be about us without us. But in practice, we see a lot of situations where there is, in fact, data imperialism going on, such as data from the islands being used by students in the Netherlands, many of them without roots in the Caribbean, for their thesis and their articles. And that's painful. And again, maybe it cannot be fixed, but it should be, we should talk about that. And I'm not blaming so much anyone that perhaps feels now like, oh, I'm doing that, because I understand that this is the situation in Dutch universities and that people are, doing whatever they can within in their sphere. But still, we need to talk about that. And then coming to the, changing the perspective, to the Caribbean, there is insufficient access to heritage materials originating in the Caribbean. And of course, this is where we will discuss DLOG. So why should we have a conversation about this? And why do I want to extend that conversation with you? Well, first of all, what we see in the Dutch Caribbean is still limited access to heritage sources. And there has been a study, referring to this, an inventory of sources on the history of slavery and colonialism in the Dutch Caribbean islands, showing, that discrepancy and that inequality, and that we need to even that. Second, whose problem is this? And I like this one because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Like in this quote, instead of achieving independence, the territory's real struggle nowadays is for obtaining true equality with the metropolis, as well as recognition of their distinct cultural identities. So is that struggle our problem? And third, this element, I think, is something many of you living and working on the islands will recognize. Being a facilitator first and a colleague scholar in second place. And this article that was published a few years ago really resonated with a lot of people doing research here, working here as a researcher. My flight arrives at 5 a.m. Can you pick me up? The gatekeeping burden of the African academic. And that really started my thinking about this because I am the one picking people up. And I'd love, everyone in this room, feel welcome. I will pick you up from the airport and I will ask you if you are a vegetarian or not. I will take you to very nice places and I will do that with all the love within me. But I am a scholar and I want to be a peer. And it's very hard to be a peer when you are the lady taking care of all of this. So how can we move beyond that facilitation? Then there's this other element. How is it all organized? What's the digital humanities landscape? What is the infrastructure that we are working with? That's an interesting one because we know what's going on in the Caribbean with DLOC, with Archipelagos, and the Caribbean Digital Scholarship Collective. Now, what is the reality? What's the infrastructure for this, in this non-sovereign territory? It's the Netherlands in Europe working with Dutch Caribbean archives and libraries, as if that's the realm, as if that's our scope, that's our sphere. And I try to be an ambassador for breaking up this and showing how, a more integral approach will benefit the Netherlands as well. And it's quite a struggle. And what's the landscape then for the research? You see here a picture of the university in Aruba. There's a university in Aruba, Curacao and St. Martin, offering mostly vocational education at bachelor level in various disciplines. In some very sort of relevant for the island topics, there are master degrees and being offered. And some people in these universities are participating in consortia and through chairs. But that's quite limited. Because of that, because of the situation of the universities being very much focused on vocational training, you have this extramural world in which a lot of academics work independently, and I'm one of those. And they are doing a lot of work either within other institutes or independently. So institutes like the Heritage Institute in archaeology and anthropology and some archives and libraries are doing research very often in consortia. And then there's an estimate 30 to 40% of scholars, not being part of a university, but still being part of consortia. And it's important to notice that these affiliations, if they work in affiliations with Dutch universities, for instance, they offer PhD supervision, which most PhD students, of course, very much aspire for, because it's a different, I don't need to explain this, but it has a lot of added value, but it's not paid. There's no way Dutch universities can pay their researchers. So how is this field organized? Well, in the Netherlands, in The Hague, there's the Dutch Research Council, and they have a lot of money and they spend that in programs around specific themes or open competition. So it will then be offered to a program which has a host institute and a principal investigator in one of the Dutch universities, and then the work packages, and the money is divided through all these work packages. And what are the conditions? What are the rules? And this is interesting. The rules are that you need academic institutes for the execution and supervision of research. And these can be anywhere. So these can be, in theory, one of the three in the Caribbean. And you need academic institutes and social partners. And these social partners will be reimbursed for their costs through a material budget. So not their personnel. So these archaeological institutes or libraries here on the islands, if they participate, they will not be paid as researcher, but as consultant. And the academic research execution is only funded when the researcher is employed by an academic institute within the kingdom, employed. So you need to have a fixed employment. And that requires residency in the same country, the same jurisdiction as the institute. So the system was never broken. It was built this way. And we cannot, in whatever we want to do, we cannot change this if the universities will remain doing what they do on the islands, which is limited for a good reason. I'm not blaming anyone, but for a good reason. We don't have humanities departments. We don't have history departments. There's no cultural studies. There's a lot of request for that, but we don't have the departments. We don't have the supervision. We don't have the capacity on the islands. So you will remain in this forever. And this is why, to sort of try and open up the discussion, I've looked at global research, particularly from African countries, South Africa in particular. And I've looked at the gateways, the infrastructure, and the gatekeeping, the way we work together. And I come up with 3 insights. First, you need to co-design a funding system if you want equal access and optimal benefit for all, including the extramural scholarship. So if the universities in the Netherlands do want the experts from the islands, you need to have a different funding system. You cannot work together equally in the way it is organized now. You need also to co-design the knowledge resource infrastructure, providing equal access across the kingdom to academic and heritage sources. You need to break open that tunnel. We are no longer, this imperial silo. We're part of a transnational world. And this is a second insight. And third, invest in sprint digitization and contextualized accessibility of heritage materials relevant to education and research in and about former colonies. And I feel very strongly about that also, because this digitization is needed to teach children here about their own culture. And then the gatekeeping in the sense of how do we then work together in an ethical way. I think we need to work on codes of conduct for all interactions with scholars. We need to agree on no facilitation without fair pay. You cannot, you can hug and share dinner, and you can, bring wine or whatever. But, we're beyond that. If your partner also has a PhD, is publishing, and has insights that are so of key value to your research. And that is the third, no facilitation without equal academic opportunities. And this is something that I do myself. If I discuss partnerships, the first thing I ask is, okay, can I publish with you? Can I be part of whatever you do on academically? So here we are. Is there a last slide? There is. And And I just want to mention north-south. There was a question about that at LASA at Paris. I started reusing that when I found out that I was kicked out and not even assessed in a fellowship program because somewhere in this vast, system, I said I was from the south. They asked for north or south, and then I wasn't even assessed because they were looking at that stage for people who were part of the Netherlands. And then I had to explain, but part of the Netherlands is in the global south. Okay, I think it's worthwhile looking at that. So we need to look beyond what looks as Western. I know that very much many elements of the Dutch Caribbean look very Western, but there is so much beyond that situation. We need to acknowledge that working exclusively in institutional frames implies substantial exclusion, and rethink by follow the money in the current geopolitical reality, and working towards new solidarities within our communities. So with that, I want to thank you for listening.
Thank you. And I want to thank all three of our panelists today, guests